I've built an empire worth $50 million. But sitting here in my corner office on the 47th floor of Manhattan, surrounded by awards and diplomas that nobody cares about anymore, I'm starting to realize that money can't buy you the one thing that matters most: genuine love from your own children. My name is Richard Hartwell, and at 68 years old, I've mastered every aspect of real estate development except the most important one: building meaningful relationships with my family. The irony isn't lost on me. I can construct luxury condominiums that families cherish for generations. Yet I can't seem to connect with my own kids beyond monthly bank transfers. Every month, like clockwork, I send money to my 3 children. Michael gets $15,000 for his Wall Street lifestyle. Sophia receives $20,000 to maintain her Beverly Hills social status. And Jake never asks for anything, which somehow makes me send him money anyway. But here's what really gets to me. The only time my phone rings is when those transfers are delayed by even a day. Last week, I decided to run a little experiment. I delayed Michael's transfer by 48 hours. Sure enough, my phone buzzed at exactly 9:17 a.m. on day 3. "Dad, there seems to be an issue with my account," he said. No greeting, no "how are you feeling?" Just straight to business. When I explained it was a banking error, he hung up without another word. The pattern became crystal clear when I looked at my call log. In the past 6 months, I'd received exactly 11 phone calls from my children. Every single one was about money. Not one was about me. My mind drifted back to last Thanksgiving, sitting alone at a dining table that seats 12, staring at the untouched turkey my housekeeper had prepared. Michael was closing a major deal and couldn't make it. Sophia was attending some charity gala in Los Angeles that was apparently more important than family dinner. Jake showed up around 8 p.m., still wearing his mechanic's coveralls, apologizing profusely about being late because he was helping an elderly neighbor fix her furnace. We sat there, just the 2 of us in my Upper East Side penthouse worth more than most people see in a lifetime. Jake kept asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, whether I was eating enough. Meanwhile, my other 2 children were posting Instagram stories from their respective social events, not even mentioning it was Thanksgiving. That night changed something in me. I started paying attention to the little things I'd been ignoring for years. When Jake called, which he did every Sunday like clockwork, he never mentioned money. Instead, he'd ask about my health, whether I was getting enough sleep, if I wanted to grab dinner sometime. I always made excuses, too busy with business meetings or social obligations that felt important, but left me feeling empty. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. I had raised 2 children who saw me as an ATM, and one who actually cared about my well-being. But I'd been so focused on success that I'd never noticed the difference. Standing at my office window, watching the bustling streets of Manhattan 47 floors below, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out which of my children truly loved me, not my bank account. But this wouldn't be some gentle heart-to-heart conversation. This required something more dramatic, more definitive. I was going to fake my own financial ruin. The plan started forming in my mind as I walked past my empty conference room, where family photos should have been but were replaced by architectural models and investment charts. I would create the most convincing bankruptcy story possible. I'd sell my visible assets, dismiss my staff, and spread the word that Richard Hartwell had lost everything. In a series of catastrophic investments, then I'd sit back and watch how my children reacted when they thought the money was gone. I reached for my phone to call my attorney, Harold Thompson, who'd been handling my legal affairs for over 2 decades. Harold was discreet, thorough, and most importantly, he understood the value of loyalty, something that seemed to be in short supply in my family these days. But as I dialed his number, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning that I chose to ignore. What if this test revealed truths I wasn't prepared to handle? What if the son I least expected turned out to have secrets that would redefine everything I thought I knew about my family? I pushed those doubts aside and made the call. Richard Hartwell was about to discover which of his children truly deserved his legacy, But what he didn't know was that the son he least expected would end up teaching him the real meaning of wealth. Harold Thompson's law office on East 42nd Street has witnessed some of the most complex financial maneuvers in Manhattan's history. But when I walked into his mahogany-paneled conference room that Tuesday morning, I could tell by his expression that what I was proposing was unlike anything he'd handled before. "Richard, let me get this straight," Harold said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he reviewed my handwritten notes. "You want me to create fraudulent bankruptcy documents to test your children's loyalty?" His voice carried that careful tone lawyers use when they're trying to talk clients out of potentially disastrous decisions. I leaned back in the leather chair that had hosted countless business deals over the years. "Not fraudulent, Harold, fictional. There's a difference. We're not filing anything with the courts or the IRS. We're simply creating a convincing narrative backed by realistic documentation." Harold's fingers drummed against his Mont Blanc pen, a nervous habit I'd observed during our 23-year professional relationship. "And you're absolutely certain about this approach? There are other ways to evaluate your children's character that don't involve elaborate deception." "I've tried subtle approaches for years," I replied, watching the morning sunlight stream through his corner office windows. Gentle conversations, family dinners, even that disaster of a last Thanksgiving. Nothing gives you honest reactions like genuine crisis. When people think the money's gone, their true nature surfaces. What I didn't tell Harold was that I'd already started the preliminary groundwork. 3 days earlier, I'd contacted my financial advisor at Goldman Sachs and instructed him to quietly transfer my assets to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Not hiding them, just repositioning them where they'd be invisible to casual observation. The account numbers were burned into my memory. 4477-8823-9901 for the primary holding company. 4477-8823-9902 for the real estate portfolio liquidation fund. "Walk me through the timeline again," Harold said, opening his laptop to take detailed notes. "Phase 1 begins immediately," I explained, pulling out a manila folder containing property deeds and investment statements. "I've already listed my Bentley for sale. Should be gone by Friday. This weekend, I'm dismissing Maria, my housekeeper of 15 years, making sure the neighbors notice the sudden staff reduction. I want whispers starting in the Upper East Side social circles before I make any official announcements." Harold's eyebrows raised slightly. "You're really selling the Bentley?" "Already have a buyer. Some tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley offered me full asking price after one phone call. The beauty is, I'm transferring ownership to my LLC in the Caymans, then selling it back to myself through a shell company. On paper, it looks like a forced liquidation. In reality, the car will be waiting for me in a private garage in Queens." The plan was more intricate than I'd initially shared with Harold. Over the past week, I'd been methodically creating the infrastructure for my fictional bankruptcy. I'd opened new bank accounts under my investment LLC, transferred exactly $247,000 in assets through a series of legitimate but complex transactions, and even arranged for my primary Manhattan bank to send me official-looking notices about account restructuring due to significant portfolio losses. Phase 2 involves the official announcement, I continued, sliding a typed document across Harold's desk. "I need you to draft a letter explaining that I've lost everything due to a series of catastrophic real estate investments in the Florida market. The story needs to be believable, but not verifiable. Something about underwater commercial properties and failed resort developments." Harold scanned the outline I'd prepared. "You've really thought this through. But Richard, what if your children try to help in ways you're not expecting? What if they want to involve financial advisors or investigate the losses?" That question had kept me awake for the past 3 nights. "That's actually what I'm hoping for," I admitted. "I want to see who rushes to help and who runs for the hills. I want to know which of my children sees a father in crisis versus a failed investment opportunity." The 30-day timeline was crucial, long enough to observe genuine behavioral patterns, short enough to minimize potential damage to relationships that might still be salvageable. I'd calculated every detail: the gradual asset liquidation, The strategic rumors planted through my social circles, even the timing of my announcement to coincide with Michael's quarterly bonus season and Sophia's annual charity circuit. "Harold, I need those documents by Friday," I said, standing to shake his hand. "Bankruptcy petition template, asset liquidation notices, even some official-looking correspondence from fictitious creditors. Make it comprehensive enough to convince anyone who might want to verify the details." As I walked toward the elevator, Harold called out one final concern. "Richard, are you prepared for the possibility that this test might reveal truths about your family that you can't undo?" I paused, my hand on the elevator button, thinking about Jake's concerned phone calls and my other children's calculated indifference. "Harold, I think those truths are already there. I'm just finally ready to see them clearly." But as the elevator descended toward the bustling Manhattan street, I had no idea that my carefully orchestrated test would uncover a secret about my youngest son that would completely redefine my understanding of success, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be wealthy. The call to Michael came first, precisely at 2:30 p.m. on a Friday, strategically timed when Wall Street's energy peaks and emotions run highest. I'd rehearsed this conversation in my mind dozens of times, but hearing my own voice deliver the devastating news felt surreal, like watching someone else's life implode. "Michael, I need to tell you something important," I began, sitting in my soon-to-be former penthouse overlooking Central Park. "I've lost everything. The Florida investments collapsed, creditors are circling, and I'm filing for bankruptcy next week." The silence on the other end stretched for exactly 17 seconds. I counted. When Michael finally spoke, his voice carried that cold, analytical tone he'd perfected during his 15 years at Goldman Sachs. "How much are we talking about, Dad? What's left? Not, are you okay? Or, how are you handling this? Just straight to the numbers." Classic Michael. "Nothing's left," I replied, injecting genuine exhaustion into my voice. "The penthouse goes to the bank. The investment portfolio is gone. Even my retirement accounts got liquidated to cover margin calls. I'm looking at maybe $50,000 in checking accounts after the lawyers get paid." I could practically hear the calculator running in Michael's head. $50,000 wouldn't even cover his monthly expenses, let alone provide the financial security net he'd grown accustomed to having. "Dad, I'm going to need to call you back. I'm in the middle of a major acquisition, and this timing is complicated. Let me process this and figure out what options we have." The line went dead before I could respond. No offer of help, no invitation to stay with him in his Tribeca loft, nothing. Just a promise to figure out options, which, knowing Michael, meant calculating how to minimize his exposure to my financial disaster. The call to Sophia 2 hours later went exactly as predicted, but somehow felt even more painful. "Daddy, please tell me this is some kind of mistake," she said from her Beverly Hills mansion, her voice carrying that performative concern she'd mastered during her years in Los Angeles social circles. "I mean, how does someone just lose $50 million? Bad investments, sweetheart. I trusted the wrong people, and the Florida real estate market crashed harder than anyone predicted. I'm sorry, but those monthly transfers you've been receiving, they have to stop immediately." The pause was shorter this time, maybe 5 seconds, before Sophia's priorities became crystal clear. "Daddy, I have the Whitmore Foundation Gala next month. I've already committed to a $25,000 table sponsorship, and if I back out now, my reputation in the charity circuit will be ruined. Can't you postpone this bankruptcy thing until after the social season ends?" I actually laughed, not from humor, but from the absurdity of my daughter asking me to time my financial ruin around her social calendar. "It doesn't work that way, Sophia. The creditors don't care about your gala schedule." "Well, this is just devastating," she replied, though her tone suggested she was more concerned about explaining my downfall to her Beverly Hills friends than about my actual well-being. "I'll have to completely restructure my fall calendar. The Aspen house rental, the charity commitments, everything depends on those transfers." Before hanging up, she mentioned something about needing to reassess our relationship dynamics and promised to call back after consulting with her financial advisor. Code for her wealthy husband who'd been bankrolling. Her lifestyle anyway, 2 calls down, 1 to go. But Jake's reaction would prove to be completely different. When I called Jake at 6:15 p.m., he was just finishing his shift at Murphy's Auto Repair in Queens. I could hear the sounds of the garage in the background. Air compressors hissing, classic rock playing on someone's radio, the everyday sounds of honest work. "Dad, is everything okay? You never call on Friday evenings." The genuine concern in his voice almost made me abandon the entire plan right there. This wasn't the calculated politeness of Michael or the performative worry of Sophia. This was real fear that something had happened to me. "Jake, I need to tell you something difficult. I've lost everything. The business, the properties, all of it. I'm filing for bankruptcy and I don't know what comes next." The silence from Jake felt different. Not calculating or self-interested, but processing. Trying to understand how he could help rather than how this would affect him. "Dad, where are you right now? Are you safe? Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" My throat tightened unexpectedly. Of all the questions my children could have asked, Jake was the only one who cared about my immediate safety and shelter. "I'm still in the penthouse until next week. But after that," I let my voice trail off, genuinely curious about what he'd offer. "You're coming to stay with me," Jake said without hesitation. "I know my place in Queens isn't what you're used to, but it's home, and you're always welcome here. We'll figure everything else out together." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my test was already revealing truths I'd suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. But what I didn't know yet was that Jake's kindness came from a place much deeper than simple family loyalty. A secret that would completely redefine my understanding of what it means to be truly wealthy. The following week painted a picture so stark that even I, with all my careful planning, wasn't prepared for the emotional gut punch of watching my family dynamics play out in real time. Michael's disappearing act began on Monday morning. When I called his direct line at Goldman Sachs, his assistant Jennifer, who'd been cheerfully connecting my calls for years, suddenly developed a case of selective deafness. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell, but Mr. Michael is in meetings all day," she said with the kind of polished coldness that only comes from explicit instructions. "I can take a message, but his calendar is completely booked through the end of the month." I tried his cell phone. Straight to voicemail. I tried texting. Read but not replied. By Wednesday, I realized that Michael had effectively erased me from his life with the efficiency of a corporate restructuring. His secretary even had the audacity to suggest I schedule an appointment if I needed to discuss business matters with my own son. The message was crystal clear. Bankrupt Richard Hartwell was no longer worth Michael's time or professional reputation. I wondered if he'd told his colleagues at Goldman Sachs that his father had lost everything, or if he'd simply pretended I'd never existed. Sophia's approach was more elaborate, but equally devastating. She actually answered her phone on Tuesday, but what followed was a masterclass in passive-aggressive abandonment. "Daddy, I've been thinking about our conversation," she said, her voice carrying that fake concern she'd perfected during her years in therapy. "I really think you should use this as an opportunity for personal growth. Maybe this financial setback is the universe telling you to simplify your life." Personal growth. The universe. I was 68 years old, supposedly facing homelessness, and my daughter was offering me spiritual platitudes instead of practical help. "I had lunch with Dr. Martinez yesterday," she continued, referring to her Beverly Hills therapist. "He thinks it would be healthy for both of us to establish some boundaries during this transitional period. You know, so I don't enable any unhealthy financial patterns. Translation: don't call me until you get your money back." By Thursday, Sophia had canceled our standing Sunday brunch at the plaza, a tradition we'd maintained for 3 years, citing prior commitments that had mysteriously appeared on her calendar. When I suggested we meet somewhere less expensive, she explained that her emotional bandwidth was limited, due to the stress of my situation. Woman who'd spent the last decade attending every charity luncheon in Los Angeles suddenly couldn't find 30 minutes to grab coffee with her father. But then there was Jake. Tuesday evening, while I was still reeling from Michael's professional ghosting and Sophia's therapeutic abandonment, My youngest son showed up at my penthouse door carrying a duffel bag and a container of homemade lasagna. "I figured you might not be eating much," he said, setting the food on my granite kitchen counter that still gleamed from Maria's final cleaning before I'd dismissed her. "Mom's recipe. Remember how she used to make this when we were kids and you had rough days at work?" I did remember. Helen had passed away 12 years ago, but Jake had somehow preserved not just her recipe, but her understanding that food was love made tangible. "Jake, you didn't need to—" "Dad, stop," he interrupted gently. "I've been thinking about this all week. I want you to take my savings account. It's not much, about $15,000, but it should cover your basic expenses while you figure things out." I stared at him, genuinely speechless. Jake worked as a mechanic at Murphy's Auto Repair, probably earning $40,000 a year if he was lucky. $15,000 represented months of careful saving, money he'd probably been setting aside for his own dreams. "I can't take your savings, son." "You're not taking anything," Jake said, pulling out his checkbook and writing the amount before I could protest further. "This is what family does. Besides, I've already cleared out the spare room in my apartment. Well, it's not really a spare room, it's more like a large closet with a window. But I bought an air mattress, and it's actually pretty comfortable." As he spoke, Jake was already mentally rearranging his life to accommodate me. No hesitation, no conditions, no therapy speak about boundaries or enabling. Just immediate, practical action born from genuine concern. "The neighborhood's different from what you're used to," he continued, "but Mrs. Rodriguez next door makes incredible Puerto Rican food. And there's a great diner 2 blocks away where you can get coffee and read the paper. The 7-train connection to Manhattan is pretty reliable if you need to meet with lawyers or handle business stuff." I watched my youngest son, the one I'd always considered the least successful, transform my impending homelessness into a detailed plan for basic dignity and comfort. While his siblings calculated their distance from my downfall, Jake was calculating how to make his modest life work for both of us. That night, as I lay in my king-sized bed for what I thought might be the last time, I realized that my test was revealing something profound about character versus circumstances. But I had no idea that Jake's extraordinary kindness wasn't just about family loyalty. It came from a secret that would completely redefine my understanding of true success. Moving from a 3,000-square-foot penthouse on the Upper East Side to Jake's 600-square-foot apartment in Astoria felt like relocating to another planet. But what struck me most wasn't the dramatic downsizing. It was discovering a version of my son I'd never bothered to notice. Jake's apartment occupied the second floor of a converted 1920s brick building on 31st Avenue, sandwiched between a Greek bakery and a family-owned laundromat. The narrow staircase creaked with each step, and the hallway smelled like a mixture of fresh bread and fabric softener, oddly comforting after years of sterile luxury. "Welcome to Casa Jake," my son said, fumbling with 3 different locks on his green-painted door. "Fair warning, the walls are thin. Mrs. Chen downstairs watches Korean dramas at full volume, and the radiator sounds like someone's torturing a saxophone. But the rent's reasonable and the neighbors actually talk to each other." The apartment itself was a masterclass in efficient living. Every square foot served multiple purposes. The dining table doubled as Jake's desk, the couch converted into my temporary bed, and the kitchen was barely large enough for one person to cook while another made coffee. But somehow, Jake had made it feel like home. What immediately caught my attention were the details I'd never noticed during my brief, uncomfortable visits over the years. Jake's bookshelf contained an eclectic mix of automotive repair manuals, classic literature, and what appeared to be mathematics textbooks. His walls displayed not the sports posters or automotive calendars I'd expected, but framed certificates and a collection of hand-drawn pictures that looked like children's artwork. "Who's the artist?" I asked, examining a crayon drawing of what appeared to be Jake teaching a group of stick figures. "Oh, those," Jake said, his cheeks reddening slightly. "Just some kids from the neighborhood. They're always giving me drawings and stuff." Before I could ask more questions, Jake was already transforming his living space to accommodate my presence. He'd moved his tool collection to the fire escape, rearranged furniture to create a private corner for me, and somehow procured an actual bed frame for the air mattress, making my temporary situation feel less like an emergency crash and more like a planned living arrangement. The first week revealed Jake's daily routine with mathematical precision. He left for Murphy's Auto Repair every morning at 7:15 a.m., carrying a thermos of coffee and a brown bag lunch. He returned around 6:30 p.m., usually covered in grease stains and smelling like motor oil, but always asking about my day before taking a shower. What puzzled me were the evenings. 3 nights a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. Jake would change into clean clothes, pack a worn leather messenger bag with books and supplies, and disappear for 3 hours. When I asked where he was going, he'd offer vague responses about community stuff or helping out some folks. The neighbors' reactions to my presence provided the most revealing insights into Jake's character. Mrs. Rodriguez from apartment 3B brought us a casserole and spent 20 minutes telling me how Jake had fixed her son's bicycle for free and helped her elderly mother with grocery shopping. Tommy from the Greek bakery downstairs insisted on sending up free pastries, explaining that Jake had never accepted payment for the numerous times he'd repaired the bakery's delivery truck. "Your son's good people," Tommy said in his thick accent. "Always helps, never asks for nothing back. Real rare these days. By Friday, I'd counted at least 6 neighbors who'd gone out of their way to express appreciation for Jake's help with everything from plumbing problems to computer issues to moving furniture. This wasn't the social networking of Manhattan's wealthy elite. This was genuine community built on mutual assistance and respect. But it was on Saturday evening that my curiosity reached its breaking point. Jake emerged from his room wearing khakis and a button-down shirt, the closest thing to formal wear I'd ever seen him in, carrying that mysterious messenger. Bag bulging with books and papers. "Community meeting again?" I asked casually. "Something like that," Jake replied, avoiding eye contact in a way that suggested he was being deliberately evasive. "Should be back around 10. There's leftover Chinese food in the fridge if you get hungry." After he left, I found myself alone in the apartment, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd never really tried to understand. That's when I noticed the manila envelope on Jake's desk, partially hidden under a stack of automotive magazines. The return address read, Franklin Community School, with a note attached. "Jake, thank you for everything you do for our families. The children can't wait to see you Tuesday. Franklin Community School, Tuesday nights." The pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed began forming in my mind, but the picture they created didn't make sense with everything I thought I knew about my youngest son. As I sat in that modest Queens apartment, listening to Mrs. Chen's Korean dramas through the thin walls, I realized that my test to determine which child truly cared about me had already revealed something more profound than I'd expected. But I was about to discover that Jake's evenings held a secret that would completely reshape my understanding of success, sacrifice, and what it really means to make a difference in the world. Tuesday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes New York feel electric with possibility. I watched Jake prepare for another one of his mysterious outings, this time paying closer attention to details I'd previously overlooked. He spent extra time organizing his messenger bag, carefully packing what appeared to be worksheets, pencils, and a small whiteboard. When he thought I wasn't looking, I caught him slipping a package of granola bars and juice boxes into a separate grocery bag. Hardly the supplies someone would need for a casual community meeting. "See you later." "Dad," Jake called out, but there was something different in his voice tonight, a kind of excited energy that reminded me of how he used to sound as a kid on Christmas morning. After waiting 15 minutes to ensure he wouldn't double back for forgotten items, I made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. I was going to follow my own son. The October evening air bit through my jacket as I hurried down 31st Avenue, trying to maintain a discreet distance while keeping Jake's distinctive walk in sight. He moved with purpose through the residential streets of Astoria, past the Greek restaurants and family-owned markets that gave this neighborhood its character. Jake's destination turned out to be exactly 12 blocks from his apartment. Franklin Community School, a modest brick building that looked like it had been serving the neighborhood since the 1950s. The main entrance was locked and dark, but I watched Jake walk confidently around to a side door marked Community Access, Evening Programs. I positioned myself across the street behind a parked van, feeling simultaneously foolish and intrigued. What was my son, a mechanic who'd barely graduated high school, doing at an elementary school on a Tuesday night? Through the illuminated windows of what appeared to be a classroom, I could see Jake setting up chairs in a circle, writing something on a whiteboard, and arranging papers on several small desks. But it wasn't until the families started arriving that the full picture began to emerge. The first to arrive was a young Latina woman with 2 children who couldn't have been older than 8 and 10. They ran directly to Jake, who greeted them with the kind of warm familiarity that only develops over time. Next came an elderly Bangladeshi man with his granddaughter, followed by a tired-looking woman with 3 kids who were clearly excited to be there. Within 30 minutes, Jake's classroom held approximately 15 children and 8 adults. Representing what appeared to be the United Nations of Queens, I spotted families who were clearly Mexican, Pakistani, Korean, and Ethiopian based on their conversations in multiple languages. But what happened next completely shattered every assumption I'd ever made about my youngest son. Jake began the session by writing math problems on the whiteboard, not simple addition, but complex algebra and geometry that would challenge most high school students. The children, ranging in age from about 7 to 15, eagerly raised their hands to solve problems while their parents took notes in worn notebooks. I watched, mesmerized, as my son, the child I'd always considered the academic disappointment of the family, transformed into a patient, skilled teacher. He explained mathematical concepts in both English and broken Spanish, drew diagrams that made abstract ideas concrete, and celebrated every small victory with genuine enthusiasm. During a break, I observed Jake distributing the granola bars and juice boxes he'd packed, making sure every child had a snack. Several parents approached him with papers, what looked like school forms or homework assignments, and I watched him help them navigate documents that were clearly challenging. For non-native English speakers, "Mr. Jake, can you help me with this one?" asked a small boy with a thick accent, pointing to a word problem about calculating areas. "Of course, Miguel," Jake replied, kneeling down to the child's eye level. "Remember what we practiced last week about breaking big problems into smaller pieces?" The interaction was so natural, so filled with mutual respect and affection, that I had to grip the fence I was leaning against to steady myself. This wasn't volunteer work in the casual sense. This was a calling, a commitment that clearly ran deep enough to reshape Jake's entire weekly schedule. As the session continued, I pieced together fragments of conversation that revealed the scope of what Jake had created. These weren't just random tutoring sessions. This was a comprehensive educational support program for immigrant families, combining math tutoring for children with English literacy help for parents. I heard parents thanking Jake in multiple languages, saw children hugging him goodbye, and witnessed the kind of genuine community impact that I'd spent decades trying to achieve through charitable donations and board positions. When the session ended around 9:30 p.m., I watched Jake stay behind to clean up, carefully storing supplies and leaving the classroom exactly as he'd found it. As families filtered out, many stopped to shake his hand or offer brief conversations in their native languages, interactions that clearly meant the world to both sides. Walking home in the darkness, maintaining my distance behind Jake's familiar silhouette, I realized that my understanding of success had been turned completely upside down. But what I was about to discover would reveal that Jake's commitment to education came from a place even deeper than simple altruism, a secret that would redefine my entire concept of what it means to leave a meaningful legacy. Thursday evening, I couldn't resist returning to Franklin Community School. What I'd witnessed on Tuesday had shaken me so profoundly that I needed to understand the full scope of what Jake had built in this modest Queens neighborhood. While I'd been dismissing him as the family disappointment this time, I positioned myself closer to the building, near enough to hear conversations through the partially open windows. The autumn air carried fragments of Jake's voice as he worked with the same diverse group of families. But tonight, I was determined to learn how this extraordinary program had begun. During the break, I overheard Jake talking with Mrs. Santos, the Latina woman whose children had been among the first to arrive on Tuesday. "Mr. Jake, do you remember when you first helped my Miguel with his math homework?" she asked in heavily accented English. He was crying every night because he couldn't understand the problems, and I couldn't help him because my English wasn't good enough. Jake's response revealed a story that hit me like a physical blow. I remember perfectly. Mrs. Santos. It was 3 years ago, right outside Murphy's garage. Miguel was sitting on the curb, maybe 8 years old, just sobbing over his homework while you were inside asking my boss if we could fix your car for less money because times were tight. The memory was clearly vivid for both of them, but Jake continued with details that painted a picture of empathy I'd never seen in any of my children. "You looked so helpless, trying to comfort Miguel while dealing with a broken transmission and bills you couldn't afford. I'd just finished working on a BMW owned by some Wall Street guy who'd spent more on his lunch than your family had for groceries that week. The contrast it broke something open in me." Mrs. Santos nodded, tears visible even from my distant vantage point. "You sat with Miguel right there on the sidewalk and helped him understand those math problems. First time in months I saw him smile about school." "That's when I realized something," Jake said, his voice carrying a conviction I'd never heard before. "I'd been complaining about not having enough money, not having a college degree, not having the success that Dad wanted for me. But Miguel needed exactly what I could offer: patience, basic math skills, and someone who cared enough to sit on a dirty sidewalk and work through problems step by step." My throat constricted as the full story emerged. Jake hadn't stumbled into this tutoring program. He'd created it from a moment of genuine human connection, built it with his own resources, and sustained it through pure dedication. "The first few weeks, it was just Miguel and me," Jake continued. "Then his sister Carmen wanted help with reading. Then Mrs. Chen from my building asked if I could help her grandson with English homework. Before I knew it, I had 8 kids showing up at my apartment every week. That's when you asked Principal Martinez about using the classroom," Mrs. Santos added. "Right. My landlord was getting complaints about too many people in the building, and I realized these families deserved better than my cramped living room. Principal Martinez was skeptical at first, some random mechanic wanting to use school space for free tutoring, but she agreed to let me try it for 1 month. The conversation revealed the scope of Jake's commitment in a way that left me stunned. For 3 years, he'd been spending his Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evenings providing free educational support to immigrant families. Not occasionally, not when convenient, but with the reliability of someone who understood that these children's futures depended on consistency. "Mr. Jake, how much do we owe you for tonight?" asked Mr. Kim, the elderly Bangladeshi man with his granddaughter. "Mr. Kim, we've had this conversation every week for 2 years, Jake replied with gentle humor. "This isn't about money. This is about making sure Fatima has the same opportunities as kids whose parents already speak perfect English. But it was the next revelation that completely destroyed my understanding of sacrifice and priority. Mrs. Santos, can I ask you something?" Jake said quietly. "Miguel's been talking about wanting a graphing calculator for his advanced math class. They're about $60 at Staples. I was thinking maybe we could organize a small fundraiser, get a few families together to help cover the cost." "Mr. Jake, you already bought Miguel 3 textbooks this semester, and Carmen's school supplies, and those winter coats for the Patel children. You can't keep spending your own money on our kids." My hands started shaking as the financial reality hit me. Jake had been using his savings, the same money he'd just offered to give me, to buy school supplies, books, and even clothing for these children. The $15,000 he'd tried to hand over wasn't just his emergency fund. It was money he'd been carefully setting aside to support his educational program. While I'd been judging Jake's success by Manhattan standards, prestigious job, expensive apartment, Impressive social connections. He'd been building something infinitely more valuable, a community of families whose children were succeeding in school because one mechanic from Queens cared enough to share his time, knowledge, and financial resources without expecting anything in return. As I walked home through the Queens streets that night, I realized that my test to determine which child deserved my fortune had revealed something far more profound than I'd intended. I hadn't just found the son who truly loved me. I discovered that the child I'd always considered a failure had been quietly creating the kind of legacy that money can't buy. The weekend after discovering Jake's secret life as an educator brought a crisis of conscience that kept me awake for 2 straight nights. Lying on that air mattress in his converted closet, listening to him quietly grade papers at his kitchen table until nearly midnight, I wrestled with a moral dilemma I hadn't anticipated when I designed this elaborate test. Should I end the charade immediately and reveal the truth? Or continue the deception long enough to give Michael and Sophia one final opportunity to show they possessed even a fraction of Jake's character? Sunday morning brought my answer in the form of 2 text messages that crystallized everything I needed to know about my older children's priorities. Michael's message arrived at 11:23 a.m. Dad, talked to my financial advisor. Bankruptcy stays on credit reports for 10 years. Might affect my security clearance at work. Need you to keep family financial issues private. We'll call when situation stabilizes. Sophia's came an hour later. Daddy spoke with Richard, her husband, about your situation. We think it's best to maintain some distance until you get back on your feet. Don't want the children asking complicated questions about Grandpa's circumstances. Hope you understand. XOXO, both messages carried the same underlying theme. My financial ruin was an embarrassment to be managed, not a crisis requiring family support. Meanwhile, Jake was in the kitchen making pancakes and asking if I wanted to join him for a walk through Astoria Park. Monday morning, I made the decision to extend my test for 2 more weeks, not because I needed more evidence of my children's character, that had become painfully clear, but because I wanted to understand the full scope of what Jake had accomplished, and I needed time to restructure my will in a way that would honor his extraordinary dedication. The call to Harold Thompson felt different this time. Instead of plotting an elaborate deception, I was planning to right a fundamental injustice in how I'd viewed success and distributed my attention as a father. Harold, I need you to draft a new will, I said from a payphone outside Murphy's Auto Repair, where I'd started spending afternoons just to understand Jake's work environment better. Completely new. Jake gets 70% of the estate, plus I want to establish a $10 million educational foundation under his direction. Harold's pause was longer than usual. Richard, are you certain about this decision? That's a dramatic redistribution from your current will. I've never been more certain about anything in my life, I replied, watching Jake through the garage window as he patiently explained transmission problems to an elderly customer who clearly couldn't afford major repairs. But there's more. I want Michael and Sophia to receive their portions with mandatory charitable contribution requirements. 25% of whatever they inherit must go to education-focused nonprofits within 5 years. That's quite specific. They need to learn what Jake already knows, that wealth without purpose is just an expensive way to be empty. That evening, I decided to give my older children one final chance to surprise me. I called both of them with a carefully crafted story about a potential insurance settlement that might recover some of my losses, wondering if the possibility of restored wealth would suddenly renew their interest in their father's well-being. Michael's response was predictably mercenary. What kind of timeline are we looking at, Dad? And what percentage recovery? When I suggested it might take 6 months and recover maybe 30% of my losses, he immediately began calculating his potential inheritance restoration. Not once did he ask about my living situation or emotional state. Sophia's reaction was even more revealing. Oh, thank God, Daddy. I've been so worried about explaining your situation to the country club. Mrs. Wellington keeps asking why you haven't. Been to the charity auction, and I've been running out of excuses. Her primary concern was social embarrassment, not my welfare. The contrast with Jake's behavior became even starker as the week progressed. Tuesday evening, I watched him teach his community class with the same dedication as always, despite working overtime at the garage to help me with expenses. Thursday, he brought home groceries and insisted on cooking dinner, explaining that he'd gotten a small bonus and wanted to celebrate by making his mom's famous pot roast. When I protested that he was spending too much on food, Jake's response revealed the depth of his character. "Dad, I've been eating cereal for dinner most nights for 3 years, saving money for things that mattered more. Having you here, cooking real meals, talking about life, this is what money should be for. Making time with people you love feels special." Friday evening, I finally made the call that would end my elaborate test. But instead of calling my children, I called Harold Thompson with final instructions. "I want to reveal everything next week. Set up a family meeting for Saturday afternoon. Somewhere neutral, maybe your conference room. Tell them it's about finalizing my bankruptcy paperwork and discussing what happens next." "And you're certain about the new will provisions?" "Harold, I've spent 40 years measuring success by the wrong metrics. Jake has been quietly building the kind of legacy that actually matters while I was focused on stock portfolios and real estate values. It's time to align my resources with my values." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my test had accomplished something I'd never intended. It had forced me to confront the possibility that I'd failed as a father not because I'd raised unsuccessful children, but because I'd been blind to the most successful child of all. Saturday afternoon arrived with the weight of reckoning. Harold Thompson's conference room on East 42nd Street had hosted countless family meetings over the years, but none had carried the emotional stakes of what was about to unfold. The mahogany table that had witnessed decades of business deals was about to become the stage for the most important conversation of my life. Michael arrived first, precisely on time, wearing his signature navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent. His handshake was firm but perfunctory, and his eyes immediately scanned the room as if calculating the meeting's potential impact on his schedule. "Dad, you look different," he said, taking in my appearance after 3 weeks of living in Queens. I'd lost weight, my hair was less perfectly styled, and I was wearing off-the-rack clothes Jake had helped me pick out at a discount store in Astoria. "Different how?" I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "More." He struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insulting. "Relaxed, I guess. Less corporate." Sophia arrived 20 minutes late, a pattern that had been consistent since her teenage years. She swept into the room wearing a designer outfit that probably cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month, immediately apologizing with the kind of breathless energy that suggested her lateness was somehow charming rather than disrespectful. Sorry. Traffic from the Hamptons was absolutely insane. Richard and I decided to extend our weekend because the weather was just perfect for sailing." She kissed my cheek with the practiced air of someone going through social motions. "Daddy, you look so much thinner. Are you eating enough?" Jake arrived exactly when I'd asked him to, carrying a small bouquet of flowers from the bodega near his apartment. "Thought maybe the meeting might be stressful," he explained quietly. Flowers always helped Mom feel better during difficult conversations. The gesture was so thoughtful, so utterly Jake, that I had to clear my throat to maintain composure. Harold began the meeting with practiced legal formality, explaining that we were gathered to discuss the final resolution of Richard Hartwell's financial circumstances. He'd prepared a folder for each of my children containing what appeared to be official bankruptcy documentation. "Before we proceed," I said, standing up from my chair, "I have something important to tell all of you. This entire bankruptcy has been a fabrication." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the traffic noise from the street below. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, calculation, and finally a cold anger that I'd never seen directed at me before. "What do you mean, fabrication?" Sophia asked, her voice rising with indignation. I walked to Harold's desk and retrieved a manila folder containing my real financial statements, the ones showing $50 million in assets, carefully preserved and protected throughout my elaborate deception. "I mean that I never lost a penny," I said, distributing copies of bank statements from my Cayman Islands accounts. "Every investment is intact, every property is still mine, every dollar is exactly where it was 3 months ago when I decided to test which of my children actually loved me versus my money." Michael stood up so quickly his chair rolled backward into the wall. "You've got to be kidding me. We've spent weeks worrying about your situation, and this was all some elaborate psychological experiment?" "Worrying?" I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. "Michael, you literally disappeared. You wouldn't take my calls, your secretary treated me like a stranger, and the only time you showed any interest was when I mentioned a possible insurance settlement." "That's different. I was protecting my professional reputation." "From your own father?" Sophia's reaction was even more explosive. "Daddy, this is absolutely unacceptable. Do you have any idea how this affected my social standing? I had to cancel charity commitments, restructure my entire fall calendar, and come up with excuses for why you weren't attending important events. Sophia, in 3 weeks of supposed financial ruin, you offered me exactly 0 practical help. No place to stay, no emotional support, nothing but advice about using my crisis for personal growth. I was maintaining healthy boundaries. You were maintaining social distance." Throughout this confrontation, Jake sat quietly, his hands folded, in his lap, processing the revelation with the kind of thoughtful calm that had become his trademark. When both his siblings had finished their indignant protests, he finally spoke. "Dad, are you okay? I mean, really okay? Because even if the money thing was fake, you seemed genuinely sad when you moved in with me. Was that part of the act too, the DUDT?" Question hit me harder than Michael's anger or Sophia's accusations. While his siblings focused on how my deception had affected them, Jake was concerned about my emotional well-being. "The sadness was real, son. I was lonely, disconnected from my children, and desperate to know if any of you loved me for who I am rather than what I can provide." "And now you know," Michael said coldly. "So what happens next? Do we all pretend this never happened and go back to our normal family dynamics?" I looked at Harold, who nodded and pulled out 3 sealed envelopes. "Actually, this test has helped me make some important decisions about my will and estate planning. Decisions that reflect what I've learned about character, loyalty, and what really matters in life." As I prepared to reveal how dramatically their inheritance expectations were about to change, I realized that this confrontation wasn't just about exposing my children's priorities. It was about finally aligning my resources with my values and ensuring that my legacy would honor the child who had already proven what it means to be truly wealthy. The 3 envelopes Harold placed on the conference table represented more than just legal documents. They were the culmination of everything I'd learned about my children's character during the most revealing month of my life as a father. "These contain the details of my new will," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "Jake, you'll receive 70% of my estate, approximately $35 million, plus a $10 million educational foundation that will be established under your direction." Jake's face went completely pale. "Dad, I don't understand. I never wanted your money. I just wanted you to be okay." "That's exactly why you're getting it, son." Michael's reaction was swift and predictable. "This is insane. You're rewarding Jake for what? Being nice to you during your fake crisis? He's a mechanic, Dad. He doesn't have the financial sophistication to manage that kind of wealth." "Michael, Jake has been managing something far more valuable than money for 3 years," I replied. "He's been managing the futures of dozens of children whose families depend on his tutoring program at Franklin Community School." The shock on Michael and Sophia's faces was complete. They'd never bothered to learn about Jake's evening activities, never asked about his community involvement, never looked beyond their assumptions about their younger brother's life. "Jake volunteers 15 hours every week teaching math and English to immigrant families," I continued. He uses his own savings to buy school supplies, textbooks, and winter clothes for children whose parents are working multiple jobs just to survive. While you two were calculating how my bankruptcy would affect your lifestyles, Jake was offering me his life savings, money he'd been setting aside to expand his educational program. Sophia's voice cracked with a mixture of disbelief and indignation. You're giving $45 million to someone who works in a garage because he helps some neighborhood kids with homework? I'm giving $45 million to someone who understands that wealth is a responsibility, not an entitlement, I corrected. Jake has already proven he knows how to invest in what matters: human potential, community development, and creating opportunities for children who might otherwise fall through the cracks. Harold distributed the remaining envelopes to Michael and Sophia. Your father has provided for both of you as well, though with specific conditions that reflect his hopes for your character development. Michael opened his envelope first, his face darkening as he read the terms. $5 million, but 25% must be donated to education-focused nonprofits within 5 years? And my inheritance is contingent on annual proof of charitable contributions? That's correct, I said. You'll receive quarterly payments only after demonstrating meaningful involvement in community service. Think of it as an opportunity to discover what Jake already knows about the satisfaction of helping others. Sophia's inheritance came with similar requirements, plus an additional stipulation that particularly addressed her priorities. $2 million of your $5 million inheritance is earmarked specifically for establishing scholarship programs for underprivileged children. You can use your social connections and event planning skills for something that actually matters. The room fell silent except for the sound of pages turning as my older children processed how dramatically their expectations had shifted. But Jake's response broke my heart in the most beautiful way possible. Dad, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't need millions of dollars to keep helping kids learn math. Mrs. Santos brings me homemade tamales. Mr. Kim taught me how to fix my bike, and Miguel drew me a picture that says, "Best teacher ever." That's already more wealth than I know what to do with. Jake, that's exactly why you're the right person to manage this foundation, I replied, my voice thick with emotion. You understand that money is just a tool. With proper funding, you could expand your program to serve hundreds of children instead of dozens. You could hire other tutors, rent proper classroom space, provide scholarships for high school students who want to attend college. The transformation in Jake's expression as he began to grasp the possibilities was extraordinary. We could create a whole network of community learning centers, not just in Queens, but in Brooklyn, the Bronx, anywhere families need educational support. Now you're thinking like a philanthropist, I said, smiling at my youngest son's immediate focus on expansion and impact rather than personal benefit. Michael and Sophia left Harold's office that afternoon with a mixture of resentment and grudging acceptance. Their inheritance, while smaller than expected, was still substantial enough to maintain comfortable lifestyles, provided they learned to channel some of their resources toward helping others. But Jake's reaction to his inheritance announcement was typically Jake. He insisted on continuing to live in his Queens apartment, keeping his job at Murphy's Auto Repair, and maintaining his Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday tutoring schedule while gradually building the educational foundation. 6 months later, I stood in the newly renovated Franklin Community Learning Center, watching Jake work with 43 children from 15 different countries. The foundation had already established 3 additional locations across New York City, hired 12 full-time tutors, and created a scholarship program that would send 27 high school students to college. I watched my youngest son, the one I'd once considered the family disappointment, coordinate an educational program that was transforming entire communities. I realized that my elaborate test had taught me something profound about the difference between inherited wealth and earned legacy. Jake had been building his fortune all along. I just finally learned how to recognize true richness when I saw it.